Hello to everybody who has joined us. Call this the punctual crowd. Appreciate everybody showing up for this webinar today. We're at the top of the hour, but we're going to give just another minute or two to let people keep rolling in. Season's greetings. Happy Festivus. Oh man, so many fun names on this list of attendees rolling in. This is like the closest thing I'm going to get to a holiday party this year. So I want you all to know that each and every one of you rolling in here is like greeting a friend at the door. This is great. Really great. We're going to give it just maybe another 30 seconds to let people keep trickling in. Oh man, this is fun. This is like reminding me how much I missed conferences this year, seeing all these names show up. Didn't miss the travel so much, but missed a lot of faces. All right, this is awesome. I think we have got to go ahead and get started. So folks, again, welcome to everybody who's joining us. So excited and just grateful that y'all could take some time out of your busy schedules to join us here today for this webinar. We are super excited, and I think it's going to be a good time for everyone. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I think most folks know Lighting Design Lab is a part of Seattle City Light. We are the utility for the city of Seattle. That's pretty awesome. They've been keeping the lab alive for like 30 years. LDL is also supported by our 2020 member utilities, so big thanks to all of them. And especially for today's event, we want to thank chief sponsor NIA, the Better Bricks organization. They were instrumental in helping inspire and motivate this project and making sure it happens. So we appreciate their support. Most of you, now that we're like several months into this pandemic, hopefully light at the end of the tunnel in sight. You guys know the deal here, but I think the only one I really want to highlight, it really is like, for folks who are having audio issues, it really is just like exiting and coming back in seems to be the thing that makes the biggest difference. So, if you're having audio issues, don't struggle with it too much. Just try that in and out method. Folks always ask, can we get a copy? Yes, you can. We've already got it primed here in the handout section, so you can download. It's actually, y'all got a double disc experience coming at you today. So I think we got 3 files in there. It's like side A, side B, and then we've actually also included our memo to industry, sort of a cover letter for the reports that we plan to post soon. So you can check that out as well. If you got questions, please use the chat box. Those will come into LDL staff, and then we got time blocked out at the end of each half to make sure we get into some question time. So that's going to be good. All right, this next slide, y'all pardon me for a second. This next slide, I had at the very end of the slide deck, and I was like, can't let that happen. So before I run out of time and then feel real awful about it, I want to say thank you to everybody up front who was involved in supporting this project. Just so many people helped out, and we couldn't have done it without just this big community. So thanks to everybody. All right, about today's speakers. Man, I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you, but not all of you, and I hope I get to meet those who I haven't met yet. So in the meanwhile, my name is John Arthur Wilson. I've been working here at the Lighting Design Lab for 3 years. Get to do a little bit of everything. And today, that means talking to you guys. So I'm real excited about that. And I'm going to be joined in the second hour by my partner here, Mr. Sean Dara, who is a senior lighting specialist with the Lighting Design Lab and has a long, storied career, veteran of the industry, as you can see. Sean, you want to say hi real quick?
Hey, everybody, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. All right. So, folks, we kind of, foreshadowed this early on in the marketing materials. The NLC user experience. It's worth highlighting before we go too much further that, what we're really talking about here is both the wall stations and the configuration apps that are the user experience. Like this is where it manifests, right? So today we're going to be talking about both the wall station side and the configuration app side. And how did this become the focus area for us, right? Well, for the last several years, the Lighting Design Lab, thanks largely in part to, the innovations and gumption Sean brought to the table, has been leading NLC workshops around the region, right? Safe to say at this point, hundreds of participants have come through. And I myself have had the, opportunity to sit through several of those classes as a direct participant and also as an observer. And one of the things you just really cannot help but notice when you just participate in that class even once, let alone sit through it a couple times, is where people have like the most significant aha moments is usually when they're touching something or holding something or a combination of both, right? It's like not really that surprising. When people get to do the hands-on part of it, it resonates, it clicks a little deeper. And in particular, watching folks program and configure tools with these application-based configuration tools, that's what we're going to be talking about. It really just was like a clear difference maker in how users and designers, product specifiers, just across the entire spectrum of audience participants, when folks had their hands on the equipment, and in particular the wall stations and the configuration tools, it was like, oh, well, now I get it. Like all those primary lighting control strategies, I get how it's easier and simple, to do it like this. Like that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that came out of these workshops is that we were working directly with industry. And in every one of these workshops, as we had 8 different NLC systems rotating through, we had manufacturers representatives, or in some case, representatives directly from the companies themselves. They're participating in the workshops, helping educate on their systems, and having that sort of like in the room together, it just really breeds a lot of great conversation and dialogue and feedback. So the combination of kind of having all the right people in the room for repeated sessions, multiple systems, it allowed us at the Lighting Design Lab to see, boy, this NLC user experience, this is the thing. And like within this opportunity to really move the market, we see some ways that really appear to be clear winners, and we see other ways that maybe, while innovative, still put up a couple barriers that maybe should come down. So marching us right along here, 2-minute refresher. I used to hate this word level set, but I'm going to use it right now. I just want to get us all on the same page. I want to talk for a minute. You guys are familiar with this. Looking over the list, I got a bunch of seasoned lighting folks, so I can be quick. When I just push a button and it all changes, you guys are hip to like this idea of scenes, right? And you can control those scenes with a combination of wall switches or with what we call a multi-scene wall switch. And this is just sort of to fast track us, folks, because we got a limited amount of time here today. I'm just gonna kind of put it out there as axiomatic, right? Like self-evident, the ability to just have single touch scene control, it's a big deal. It's like this is one of the things that when we saw it being done well in the classes, people were like, dang, well, that's simpler. But then we were like, we don't always see it like that. Maybe we need to look into this. Before we get into the survey and the results and the findings, I want to make sure everybody is just hip to, we might drop LLC, luminaire level lighting controls. You might hear us say that today. Looking over the experienced, veteran names on the phone. I think you guys are all hip to this. Luminaire level lighting controls are network lighting controls. It's just a one-to-one relationship. Everything inside, all the hardware in each fixture is individually addressable. All right, the last thing. We're almost getting there, folks. Would you believe it? This is all just a buildup. The next thing, you're going to see a lot of different wall stations shown today, and it might appear like there's winners and losers. And what I want to just stress upon all of you is please try not to focus on the brands. Focus on the designs, right? Focus on the features that stand out, and don't worry about which company name you might see on it. The fact of the matter is, for almost every single company's wall stations we looked at, there were several different examples we could have picked from, right? So the ones that we picked here don't in any way, it's like, that's not all that company has to offer. Y'all know that, but just saying it for good measure. All right, one more thing. This is just kind of like a really interesting motif. Like, this wasn't the purpose of this research project, but this is something that just really permeated and was a consistent theme throughout this project, especially as we talk to people. And it's what I call the super user tunnel vision paradox. It's a really interesting dynamic that happens when you are talking about user experiences, because people who are like really good with a particular system, even if that is like the wackest system out there, if they're super good at it and it's all they know, they're going to be like, the system's amazing. Now, none of the systems that we looked at were terrible. They were all like pretty solid systems or better. And so, it maybe wasn't dramatic as all that, but the fact remains that it's like, by virtue of doing your job really well, you develop this, at least some modicum of tunnel vision around your product, and that affects what your user experience is versus the general public or layman's or like, first time users experience. So that's more just something that's interesting that I wanted to share with you guys, and it's present, and especially looking at all the veteran names here. I can't see your faces, but hopefully some of y'all are head nodding and understand what I'm talking about. All right, we're having fun. So kind of like, I was like, man, how do I tee this up? So I was like trying to channel some of the great double discs of all times, that are out there. What y'all are about to get today, I call it the Network Lighting Controls User Experience Double Album. I'm about to spin, the wall station side, and then Sean's gonna come back and hit you with the second album. So buckle up, it's gonna be fun. Here we go. All right, wall stations. So where did we start, right? Inquiring minds want to know. We're looking at, we're in these workshops, and we're looking at everything that comes through, and we got seasoned folks at the lab, right? We're looking at all these wall stations, and you just can't. There's so many different design features out there. It's just a sea of different design features, all ostensibly trying to do the same thing. But it's not just design features, it's implementation methods, right? You see, do we put one wall station in, or do we put 3 wall stations in? Or sometimes you get them like with breakers, I think they call them wafers, right? Sometimes you get it where they put 2 into 1, right? So that's the implementation methods. And then we also were like, what is driving all this? Like, what is driving when people specify certain design features versus others? Because like I said earlier, every company offers a range of different approaches. So like, what drives all that? And is it related is there a knowledge gap, or is there something specific that we should know about, that would be helpful to know about? And like every good project, right? Like once it gets approved and funded, you start by observing the market, right? You do some recon, do your homework. So that's what we did. We started with all the industry partners that are in our LDL orbit, and we started with the gear that we had on hand, and then we went online and we just began cataloging stuff. We were like, what do we see here, right? I'm the sort of person who likes sorting Legos more than building with Legos. So for folks like myself, this is a really fun exercise. So what do we observe? Well, one of the first things we observe is, I kind of call this the old meets new trend. This is where you see there's like a distinction kind of right off the bat. You have a category of single scene wall stations versus multi-scene wall stations, right? Wall stations that are kind of like entry basic. I'm just here to turn on one set of lights, and that's what I control. Versus the multi-scene, you guys saw this earlier when we went through. One button can control multiple groups of lights or different zones to pre-programmed settings. Within, another way that we kind of broke these down, another category is we sort of observed what we call this very simple design of wall stations. It's typically less than 2 buttons, but most of the time it's just 1 button, right? We call this the very simple design. We had this category that we called the simple design. This one was typically, we called it between 2 and 4 buttons, but like 90% of the time, it's 4 buttons. Yeah, that was the simple design. And then we had one more sort of design category that we called advanced design. That was when we saw more than 4 buttons. And the reason I've got these together on this slide is just to highlight, there's so many different ways that you could slice this apple. Right here, you see an example of simple design that spans both single scene and multi-scene, right? So we were really interested in trying to carve it up and look at it from different ways. And some of these concepts I'm introducing are really gonna make a difference when we get to the findings. So bear with me, folks. You observe, right? Like manual, raise, lower, and how, right? I mean, this one's pretty self-evident, right? Is it integrated or is it a dedicated button, right? Or does it have it at all? That one's pretty self-explanatory. And there's probably more. In fact, there's definitely more. We could have sliced this even more ways, but I just kind of drew the line at 6 approaches to labeling. No labeling, indicator lights only, right? It's like really minimalist, these two. When you see majority icons, when you have generic text versus specific text, like scene specific text. And then what we'd call a hybrid, which is like, it's a combination of things. You see scene specific text, you see icons, and you see, in this case, indicator lights. So what we would call hybrid lighting. So again, probably more if we wanted to get more granular, but this was a good place for us to, that's where we drew the line. So something else that we observed, looking at all these wall stations, space types matter. Obviously, the functionality and capabilities you might need in a janitor's closet are different than what you need in this, deluxe apartment in the sky, as my colleague and I were just referencing. And I realize that when I say that, that's like a real Captain Obvious moment. Like, oh yeah, space type matters, but bear with me. As I said, folks, I promise we're gonna come back and I'm gonna layer on top of that very obvious statement. Another thing that we observed in practice is what we sort of discussed and felt was a general disconnect between modern NLC system capabilities, the approaches to multi-scene space design, right? That fancy conference room we were just looking at. And then specifying the right wall station for the space, right? We were like, man, people seem to kind of agree there's a whole bunch of different ways we can do this. And that's reflected in what shows up, because we see a whole bunch of different stuff all over the place. And with the new capabilities inherent to network lighting controls, specifically kind of that concept that I was talking about of one-touch scene control, this is where we saw sort of a disconnect between what was happening with approaches to multi-scene space design and the product that ultimately gets specified. So we came up with a hypothesis, right? We were like, okay, look, we're not talking about every single space. In fact, single scene spaces ended up not being our focus because we were like, where do these NLC systems do best? You know, that we were looking at these NLCs, these multi-scene spaces and their ability to have single button scene control. So we came up with this hypothesis. Multi-scene based, I gotta read this, folks, forgive me. In multi-scene spaces, NLC systems manifest best for tenants and facility operators when they are multi-scene based with specific labeling, right, like we see here, and when they provide manual raised dim as a dedicated feature. All right, so this picture of this wall station is like, in our eyes, this like checked all the boxes of what we thought was the best wall station in multi-scene spaces, you know, going into this whole thing. And, you know, like while we were at it, we were like, well, let's just tack a little extra hypothesis on there, which is something to the effect of, you know, the user experience is going to be worse for people who aren't familiar with key concepts of network lighting control systems. And we'll follow up with this one in the findings as well. So I know some folks are like, can we get to the findings, please? But we're actually doing really good on time. So thank you all for being so patient. Observing the market. You know, I talked about those different design types. We talked about single scene versus multi-scene. Another way that we thought, you know, when we were looking through the system and thinking about how can we organize all this, we thought about the capability spectrum. And I love the capability spectrum because it's really, really straightforward. It's like all really objective stuff. On the advanced side, it's like it's a multi-scene wall station. It's more advanced than a single scene wall station, right? It's pretty straightforward stuff that's easy to map. The capability spectrum allows us to, this is one of the ones that allows us to just like really make clean buckets of different features. On the other hand, when people are looking at wall stations and what they're all absorbing, when we first started talking about these, we found ourselves talking about this interface spectrum. And for maybe the first 3 months, this is the term that we were using, but it wasn't always super clear what we meant. Was it the number of buttons or the number of commands? Was it the style of labeling? You know, like what really was this? And it kind of makes sense on a level. You're looking at all this different stuff and it's like the interface spectrum. But after kicking this around and you know, really having it all in front of us, what we came to the clear conclusion of is it's not the interface, like it's not the interface spectrum. In fact, all those buttons, like looking at all those buttons and trying to figure out what's what is really just a big distraction at this point. What it really boils down to, the second spectrum that we want to pay attention to, is the user experience spectrum. All, you know, you want to ask yourself, is it easy to understand and operate, or is it complex and confusing? And by paying attention to this and seeing, you know, showing people different wall stations and asking them this question, we could then sort of be like, okay, what are the design approaches that resulted in the best user experiences? Like, what were the wall stations that gave people this happy, feel-good feeling? And then let's categorize, you know, were there buttons? You know, how many buttons? Were there specific text, or what was it? So this is sort of just teeing you up and explaining how we put this together. So how did we test it? Well, this was great. This is like the closest I'm ever going to get to hosting Family Feud. So this is kind of fun here. Turns into a little theme I'm going to run with. We had a survey. Official survey dates, 2 weeks long, 53 questions, 82 complete responses. We put it out to the public. Let people tell us what they think. In our survey, we included 9 wall stations. So here's the 9 wall stations, and you guys are going to see a lot of pictures of these. So don't worry about this isn't going to be the last time you see them. And for the purposes of testing, we divided these 9 wall stations into 3 categories. So sometimes when we were talking to people, they were looking at all 9 wall stations, but there's other times that we were talking to them just about category A here. And you'll notice that category A is all single scene wall stations. Different approaches, but they're all single scene. Category B is multi-scene wall stations with generic labeling. Okay, and again, you see a range within that category. And our last category, category C, is multi-scene wall stations with specific scene labeling. And you see a range of options there. Okay. This is where things get a little fun. We're actually doing great on time. So oh man, I totally blew past the let's talk about you poll. I'm sorry, gang. We'll do that in a minute. Do you guys remember these choose your own adventure books where you got to be like, if you want to go here, go back to page 36. Or if you want to skip ahead, go up to 42. Haven't you guys been on a webinar this year and you wish you could kind of control what happens next? So here we go. We're going to launch a quick poll for you guys. Launch. And you guys get to pick. Do you want 2 more really awesome slides about the survey process that we do have time for? Or are you like, go to the findings already? Yeah, they're rolling in. I mean, you guys are really, the people have spoken. And much like the OJ said, you got to give the people what they want. So, boom, I'm going to close that poll because the people spoke. I actually am going to invite my colleague, Julia Day from good old Washington State University to go ahead and unmute, and I might ask you, awesome. All right. So let's see here. Cacao. All right. I'm not going to put Julia in the unfair position of, I made this survey analysis cupcake metaphor, and it would be, but I made these slides, and it would be so unfair. It'd be like spilling batter all over your computer. But I am going to invite Julia. I'm going to tease up super high level what's going on here, and then I'm going to ask Julia to articulate it in finer fashion, and also share with us a little bit about herself and her team and what they do. So when the Lighting Design Lab said we're going to do a survey, we didn't actually really appreciate all the significant work that goes into doing a survey because it takes real experts to do it. And we are so grateful that we got partnered up with Julia's team to help make sure that we could put this survey together in a way that was legit and that worked and made sense, and the results were meaningful. So here's what I've described it as, Julia. I was like, we did all this work, which was like breaking the eggs and putting all the stuff in. We had these questions. We all the results came back, and then we sort of had to like first do an analysis by each individual question, and we put that into a giant statistical oven called the Social and Economic Sciences and Research Team. What was it? It's like the IBM statistics program. Tell us about it.
Oops, sorry, clicked the wrong button there. Good start. Well, thanks again for having me. Thanks everyone for picking the 2 more awesome slides because this is fun. So again, I'm Julia Day and I'm the director of the Integrated Design and Construction Lab. I'm over here in Pullman, Washington, where we're getting slammed with snow right now. And we were brought into this project a little bit later, like John said, to work with LDL and also the University of Washington IDL, which was a super fun process. So they'd already come up with a lot of these different scenes, looked at all of the wall stations as he's discussed, and then had quite a few survey questions actually pre-baked as well. And so we came in and gave some advice on how to change some of the questions, maybe ask some questions a little bit differently so that we were really getting at what we're looking for in the end. Then we had these, the main hypothesis at the beginning, and then actually 5 that resulted from that, kind of as we started to peel away all of the different layers. And then for each of those hypotheses, we then also had some sub-research questions. And so when we took all of that apart and started, I guess, going along with your analogy here, we had all the different ingredients. We were able to then figure out what kinds of statistical tests do we actually need to run based on the data that we have for these specific questions. So then we ran that. We worked with some colleagues at the SESRC who just do all kinds of survey work and data analysis all the time, and ran it through that and came up with a lot of awesome results, and I'm excited to show you. All right, so I think I started to talk about some of these as well. As we had our different hypotheses and research questions, if we found something interesting that we wanted to further look at, then we were able to run regressions or additional analysis to try to understand what was actually happening. We also had some open-ended responses on the survey that I should note that also were put into a program called In Vivo and qualitatively analyzed, so that we were able to kind of understand maybe why we were finding some of the things that we were finding. And then one other thing that I'll talk about here, and I think, John, you get into this a little bit more about the lighting IQ, but we were able to actually make a new variable called lighting IQ based on 2 of the survey questions. So we realized in the analysis, one of the questions was asking the participants to rate their level of knowledge about lighting controls. Another one was asking them to rate their level of comfort. And neither one of them, because of the types of people that were all taking, there were serious novices and there was also experts that weren't quite getting us to the right variable that we needed to compare some of these. So we were able to take the average of those 2 questions and come up with a new variable called lighting IQ, which guided a lot of the analysis that that John's about to dive into. So
Yeah.
I think that's that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So this is just to give you guys a quick reminder of what the hypothesis was, right? We said in multi-scene spaces, the wall stations that work the best, that the best user experience, they're multi-scene based with scene-specific labeling, and they provide manual raised dim as a dedicated feature. So like the answer was kind of this unequivocal yes, but with lots of fun highlights. All right, so we're going into the findings part here, folks. And yeah, because we're doing so great on time, I'm actually just gonna kind of let this ride. So, okay, we're gonna come back to all these right now. You guys, this is just, I really should have some like background music right now. We're actually gonna come back to all these slides. I just want you to kind of observe right now. What you're looking at right now was all 9 wall stations, most preferred to least preferred. And this is looking at all 9. Top 2 answers are on the board. We didn't restrict people, when we were during the survey process, and this is why it helps to bring in people who know about surveys. We didn't restrict people to only picking one wall station as most intuitive or least intuitive. We had another series of questions that was kind of like select your most favorite, least favorite. And for this one in particular, I want to take a moment to talk about why we allowed survey participants, why we let them pick 2. We said pick your 2 most intuitive and pick your 2 least intuitive. And the reason why is because even without like talking about it, like even without specifically providing context about single scene and multi-scene, I mean, it was almost like people were like, I'm going to pick my favorite single scene one, and I'm going to pick my favorite multi-scene one. We didn't want to be overly restrictive, you know, having these all 9 up here. We're like, just pick the 2. You don't have to pick one. And interestingly enough, for both most intuitive and least intuitive, the way it shook out is people were like, this is my favorite single scene, my least favorite single scene, and like vice versa. So more of that will come to the surface later, but that was just interesting. All right, you guys heard me talk about, we also had those 3 categories, right? And in this case, the red's not like a negative connotation. I was just trying to be Christmassy, so that's what's going on there. We had single scene, multi-scene with generic labeling, and multi-scene with specific labeling, okay? So looking within these 3 categories, you're seeing favorites and least favorites. So let's get to answering that first half of that hypothesis. Do users prefer multi-scene wall stations with scene-specific labeling? Well, we showed people pictures like this that had this approach on the left and this approach on the right, and 80% preferred it. And I mean, we showed more than one example of that, right? We're like, well, let's give them a different look at it. And this time, 84% preferred option B. We showed them an example where we were like, hey, here's a generic labeling versus scene-specific labeling, head on. 74% wanted the scene-specific labeling. And we even showed an example where we were like, we took multi-gang options out of it. We said, look, would you rather have single scene wall stations, or here's 2 examples of multi-scene wall stations. 87% were on the multi-scene side. It was a pretty, like, let me go back to this. I'm not a mathlete, but if you do percentages the way I do, that's like 3 pizzas. So pretty overwhelming consensus, right, on the old multi-scene side with the scene-specific labeling. If we go back to our most preferred, you know, all 9 spectrum, we'll look at this. 4 of the top responses, or excuse me, 3 of the top 4 are our category C, right? 3 of the top 4 responses, and in this case, y'all will recall, remember how I talked about people were like, I want my favorite multi-scene and my favorite single scene? In this instance, wall station number 2 here it's kind of like the outlier, right? But it's the outlier in a good way if you're that wall station. Survey participants overwhelmingly preferred multi-scene wall stations with scene-specific text. And if we look at the other end of the wall station, the other end of the spectrum, we see that generic text scene labeling made up 3 of the least preferred 4. So, man, that stacked itself pretty neat and tidy. From that, I'm concluding that users prefer multi-scene wall stations with scene-specific labeling. There it is, folks. The other part, the next part of the hypothesis, do users prefer wall stations with manual raise dim as a dedicated feature? We showed people pictures like this. I'm going to tell you too, a majority of wall stations have it. All right, a majority of wall stations do have it. That actually isn't something we didn't quantify, but but I'm just telling you after swimming the ocean, people, that's how it is. 94% saw value, right? A majority of people saw lots of value, right? You'll recall when we looked at the 2 most intuitive wall stations out of all 9, when I showed that earlier, what do they have in common? They've both got hybrid labeling, although slightly different forms of it. They both have dedicated raised dim. Still talking about, do users prefer manual raised dim as a dedicated feature? And looking at our most preferred to least preferred chart here, check it out. 3 of the 4 top wall stations feature it as a dedicated feature. In this case, wall station 8 is our outlier, doesn't have it at all. And down at the other end, you can see that the least 2 preferred, these guys were actually tied. Like, again, everybody's a winner who participated, but just highlighting those 2 were a tie. What do we see? an example with no manual raised dim and an example where it is an integrated, right, a press and hold variety of it. So, from these results, we concluded that yes, users do prefer manual raised dim as a dedicated feature. Okay, the next results I'm going to get into, these were not like the ones I just hit was what I'm going to call the primary focus of what we were trying to study and get at on the wall station side, but there were some other really interesting stuff that came to the surface, and it's like goes without saying, further study is recommended, right? So yeah, y'all understand that. We talked about there were 6 approaches to labeling out there. The one that really seemed to win across both single scene and multi-scene was the hybrid approach. It wasn't any single one of these. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we were seeing when we say hybrid approach. What do we mean? In single scene wall stations, the hybrid approach typically manifested as a combination of icons and indicator lights. Okay, and in multi-scene wall stations, it manifested best when it was scene-specific text with icons and indicator lights, right? Combination of these. So it wasn't the exact same, like kind of makes sense, right? That multi-scene would be a little bit more involved. Again, I said earlier, we were primarily focusing on what makes the multi-scene side tick, but I want to talk just a little bit more about single scene wall stations. This little microscope is on its way to my house. It's going to be a Christmas present for my daughter. I'm excited for that. Get excited every time I see that picture. Okay, so speaking specifically to these single scene wall stations, we talked earlier about how we saw, we kind of had these 2 different categories that were hanging out there. We had what we call this very simple design, right? That was like 1 to 2 button wall stations. And we had what we call the simple design, which was 2 to 4 button wall stations, right? And so I'm talking about labeling still, overall labeling preferences. Within these single scene wall stations, this very simple design, what we noticed is most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it was either no labeling or indicator lights only. It was these very, very minimalist like approaches to design, right? Uber simple from a design standpoint. And on the other side, for simple design wall stations, still talking single scene, but simple design, we noticed they were way more likely to have a hybrid labeling approach. And again, I'm just like within single scene wall stations, the simple design seemed to be the winner over this very minimalist approach. So more research is recommended, but that was the finding that came up here. Okay, here's where it gets kind of fun. We're pivoting towards the end here. Fewer buttons does not equal simpler, right? Like it's that, I was like, what does this feel like? It feels like a tragedy, because this wall station, you'll recall, was tied for least intuitive. And there's something like on certain levels, this wall station is so simple. If you gave somebody the goal of have as few buttons, take all the distraction out, there's 4 things going on here, yet it's not really clear what's going on. So one of the lessons that was just kind of, we couldn't ignore is that fewer buttons does not equal simpler from a user experience perspective. And in fact, we can take that a little bit further, because y'all remember category B, these multi-scene wall stations with generic labeling, these ranked at the very bottom of the spectrum out of all the wall stations. And so like this is also kind of extra tragic, because whoever specified these understood, like they understood the capabilities. They were like, yeah, I'm bringing in some high-tech stuff. Like I'm bringing in a wall station that has advanced capabilities that are going to meet the needs of this multi-scene space. And yet these are probably the most confusing, even more confusing than putting 3 single scene wall stations next to each other. because I'm such a visual person, I have just a few more slides that summarize the findings like this. We talked about you have this capability spectrum. That's like, what can it do, or what is it limited to? And you have this user experience spectrum, right? And it's pretty safe to say, like, in this case, I am being festive still, but like, simple is good and complex is not good. Okay, so like red is like warning, right? So if you are in a single scene space, right? If you're in a single scene space, then like limited is fine. Limited can be green too, because you have limited needs. And if you're in a single scene space, right, then like, man, the simple design that provides like hybrid text, dedicated raised lower, like you're achieving harmony. Everything's in balanced, right? It's like awesome. But if you're over here in a multi-scene space and you throw this up on the wall, well, then you've taken something with like inherently limited functionality and stacked it, and it's going to show up as complex. And to the user, it's not a great user experience. Okay. Similarly, if you throw this up on the wall, you've taken a wall station with advanced capabilities, but because it's got that generic labeling and people aren't clear on what it does, it's a confusing experience. That's what the data, showed us. You're not in balance. And then last but not least, we're in a multi-scene space, hybrid labeling, dedicated raised lower, and boom, like we've, brought the force back, right? So that's how I summarize those findings. Pivoting now to that bonus hypothesis that we threw out there, that user experience is worse for people who aren't familiar with network lighting technology and key concepts. Julia alluded to this when she teed up lighting IQ. We took these two questions: rate your knowledge of lighting controls and rate your comfort of lighting controls. And we kind of turned that into the self-prescribed participant lighting IQ. And those of you who know me and know me as a, general studies major might be like, John, you can't just mash questions together in a survey. And it's like, but like, we got this blessed from the highest levels that this was okay to do. And it was legit, and the social sciences allows for these sorts of things the way we did it. So just want to throw that out there as a general caveat. This lighting IQ turned out to be really important because it ended up being not just the most significant predictor, but actually our only significant predictor, right? So what people like, the wall stations that people liked or didn't like, we couldn't determine what they were going to like or not like based on age or their professional background or their gender. It was only this lighting IQ that bore that out. Okay, and you can see for our survey, we had more advanced people than probably the regular populace out there. But here's where this kind of gets cool. Okay, as a result, I said, lighting IQ, it predicts a lot. So as lighting IQ increases, other responses reliably shift. Okay, so this question 3 was like, are you familiar with scenes? And it goes without saying that like people with way higher lighting IQs were way more likely to be familiar with scenes. Okay, when we asked people like, how do you feel about tunable lighting, rate the value of tunable lighting, and when we asked them, how excited are you for digital wall stations, people with higher lighting IQs were like proportionately way more excited about these features coming on board. And on the other hand, people with higher IQs were, way less likely to say that they learned something by taking the survey or that their views shifted by taking the survey. And at this point, it's worth highlighting that this is like another Captain Obvious moment, right? You're like, well, that doesn't really, that's kind of what I would expect, right? But bear with me here. Lighting IQ also predicts user preference, okay? And one of the most interesting things to come out of this was the realization that population groups that have like lower lighting chops also have a really wide range of preferences, not just for design types, right? Like I like the ones with no buttons. I like the ones with 4 buttons. I like the ones with lots of buttons. Not just for that, but also for like, are you going with the 3-gang approach or are you going with the multi-scene approach? People with lower, you know, lighting IQs, sounds mean when you say it like that, so I gotta think of a different way to say it. People who ranked lower displayed a wider range of preferences. And on the other side, population groups who tended to agree or had higher lighting IQs, they were like way more likely to agree. It wasn't even close. I mean, they were like really, really, really streamlined on what they thought was the best approach to wall stations. Okay, so I think it's safe to say everybody has seen The Lion King. That's a safe reference to make out there, right? And y'all remember when let's see there, Simba is having being like a little churlish and not getting the message, right? And Rafiki's like, look deeper, right? We're gonna have one of those moments now, okay? And granted, this is not this is more of a homily than an axiom. That's how I've been describing this, okay? We're gonna go back to those Captain Obvious moments, but we're gonna talk about them through the sort of inverse corollary, right? Meaning, I'm gonna talk about the findings, but through like with thinking about people who actually scored much lower, who had lower lighting IQs, okay? So these questions 33 and 34, I learned something and my views shifted. And we were like, yeah, people with higher lighting IQs were way less likely to, you know, say that their views shifted. But the flip side of that is that for some people, just getting the super minimum exposure to looking at these pictures and having like really basic concepts flashed at them, for some people with lower lighting IQs, or actually I should say this, for many of the people with lower lighting IQs, they did learn something. Just taking the survey taught them something and changed their preference. So think about that, because that's a pretty low bar. I can't, like, this is one that I definitely don't want to oversimplify, but increasingly, I feel like simply understanding scenes-based lighting, scenes-based design might be enough. Like, you don't need to be an expert in all things lighting. You just need to understand this key concept that now I don't need to flip 3 switches and then mess with the dimmers. I just push 1 button and, you know, 8 lights in my house or in my office or wherever can go to a pre-programmed level. This appears to be a very significant concept. And then on the last one, these questions 28 and 31 were like, rate the value of tunable lighting, or, you know, rate, or how excited are you for digital wall stations? And an increased understanding appears to be the key to unlocking greater market transformation. So that actually is pretty cool. Like, those are the deeper findings that come out of this lighting IQ question. Our recommendations to industry, number 1, it's like, download the report, check it out, talk to us, right? Especially if you'd like to sponsor more research. Make this part of your value add. I really, like, we're not going to do it today right now, but I really am eager to have this conversation because I feel like most of the people I talk to who are product specifiers, I feel like they kind of already know that that's best practice. So I'm like, why doesn't it happen more? I'm really interested. I want to know. But we recommend that, like, this is an opportunity to stand out and bring customers in. And if there are barriers, we kind of assume there are barriers that remain to getting scene specific labels out there. So, you know, we want to encourage companies to look at this, manufacturers, I should say, to look at this process and hopefully make it easier. And then this next one is just kind of fun. Like, to me, residential lighting apps are it's a very low bar to get in and see what stuff is happening. To me, they feel like a bellwether indicator for what digital apps are going to look like, excuse me, digital wall stations might look like in, you know, commercial spaces in 5 years or 3 to 5 years or 10 years, who knows. To me, getting on a, you know, hopefully more than one, because believe me, we talked about that tunnel vision issue. To me, residential lighting apps are a really good bellwether for what's coming. And once users experience this, it's like going back to 3 single scene wall stations, it really feels retrograde. So, man, it feels like a marathon. Let's see. I'm gonna launch another poll. The webinar is not over. You guys, we're gonna put on the double disc. You guys are gonna get another heady dose. Well, why don't you go ahead and respond here. And then I think we're going to open it up for some questions. So if you have questions, I really encourage folks to please use the chat feature in the GoToWebinar menu and submit those. And I believe my colleague Sean is on board to help queue those up if they come in. I also want to highlight, let's see here, share information with your colleagues. That's cool. Get some lunch. I hear that. Some combination of all three. What I want to tell folks, or just highlight for people is we're available. We really want to make sure that this information gets out. We'll talk about that a little more at the end. But it is paramount to us that this information and the findings here don't just live with us and end up being some navel gazing exercise, right? We really want this information to get to people who it might be meaningful for, right? Or who can do something, might make a decision about it. Similarly, we want to hear from you if you're like, think the method was just garbage or got other questions. So I don't think we got too many questions. Sean, do we have any questions?
Sure, let's dive into that. Before we do that, I am gonna note that there are a couple of amusing things here for me. One of them is that the idea of obvious is going to be coming up in the second half when we queue up. Any of you who are sort of familiar with the days of double album, we'll be starting off with Dear Martha. But I do want to note that a lot of what John is talking about really comes down kind of under the rubric of to paraphrase Don Norman. If you don't know who Don Norman is, look him up and read his books. A user's manual represents a failure of design. So think about that when you're making your products and specifying them. All right, so our first question: is there a reason why they didn't prefer a rocker, with the idea that people want simple?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple things that come to mind. I had mentioned at one point how like we could have had more methods of like labeling that were out there, and I think you could make the case that a rocker is either its own category or method of labeling something, or it kind of like falls into that hybrid category. So that's possibly that passes the straight face test in my mind. If like somebody was like, John, give me your business card or whatever, because I want to hire you to do a lot of research on this, I'd be like, well, we need to make single scene wall stations its own focus area, because within single scene wall stations, it's like the water is like it's like deep, was it shallow and wide, right? Single scene, there's just so many little different nuances, and specific to single scene wall stations, I don't think we had quite enough variety that we were looking at to really walk away with like concrete answers. But the rocker wasn't intuitive. I mean, at least in this case, the rocker proved to be not intuitive. It was a least favorite and a least intuitive in 2 of the graphics I showed.
Okay, thank you. Were there any standout comments from survey respondents? Julia mentioned some open-ended questions, and I'd be interested in hearing some examples of what responses you got to those.
Yeah, there were a lot of great qualitative comments. I would say overall, the qualitative comments really reflected what you saw here. There were definitely some standouts. I'll tell you one that stands out to me. This is great. You know, when Sean just read that question, I was like, I don't know, what is there a standout one? But there definitely was. It was somebody defending generic labeling. And someone was like, generic labeling is great. You can come back and change it at any time and it's never going to be wrong. I don't know whose comment that was, and they might be on the phone. I remember reading that and being like, it's either never going to be wrong or it's always going to be wrong, one or the other. So that's actually the only one that stands out in my mind, but it's a good one. So thanks for bringing it up.
Okay. In the study, did you break down who took the survey by profession? And if so, other than lighting IQ scale, can you share that participation level?
Yeah, so we broke it down the original way. That's a great question. I made the comment earlier. Remember, I was like lighting IQ turned out to be the only significant predictor, and I listed a couple of other sort of demographic related questions. And this question that you just asked, Sean, kind of fits right into that. So we originally thought, so we asked people like, are you a facility operator or are you like a building tenant? Those were the initial categories that we had. Like you're somebody who works in a commercial building and might have these systems, or you're the facility operator. And we thought facility operators would score differently and have different preferences. That was kind of part of our initial thought process. But it turns out could not detect a difference in responses based on those backgrounds. Looking over the responses, because we also got job types, we also actually were able to go through and we actually created an additional category where we were like, hey, this person works in the lighting industry. This person works in the lighting industry. I mean, it's like not super surprising because we didn't put the survey out on Reddit. We sent it out through our networks and asked, we tried to get it as far and wide as possible, but I mean, the lighting IQ pie chart reflected this actually. It like had more people from the lighting industry than not, right? But even when we looked at like, oh, like these are like manufacturers reps, or these are utility people, right? Like specific sort of like professional background, the survey results did not show statistical significant relationships between professional background type and preferences. I hope I said that right.
Okay, thank you. John, really good research and conclusions. This is the last step from the user experience. Are you planning on tying any of this back in with the PNNL work around the commissioning of NLCs and thus the wall stations?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, they're very integrated, and in fact, Sean's gonna discuss that a little bit more in the section that he gets to. So that's actually a really beautiful segue. If there's not other questions, 100%. I mean, I said earlier, or one of the things I tried to mention is we want to make sure that we get feedback and just eyes on this research from other places, and that's not just so we can do more of it in a self-serving way, but so that we can kind of like put the Lego pieces together. And if anytime we can, partner more with organizations like PNNL and NIA and other great folks out there doing similar work, DLC's networked lighting controls, QPL comes to mind as, we might make sure like, hey guys, make sure you got this, all that stuff. We want to share it far and wide and then understand how it can be put to good use.
Thank you. Perhaps I missed this, but did the survey respondents have an application in mind? Did they assume an office or a classroom or any specific application?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we had, we never limited it, we never, I don't want to say this. We didn't have instances where we were like, in a janitor's closet, which would you prefer, versus in a multi-scene space, exactly what would you prefer? We did have instances, and this is reflected in some of the pictures that I think you can find on the slide deck, although they may be buried. So just let me know and I can help find this for you. We showed pictures that sort of represented different space types. So for instance, we would show like 3 single scene wall stations in a 3-gang configuration, and that provided at least a modicum of context around like, okay, you've either got 3 controlling 3 zones or you have 1. So we showed people combinations of pictures like that as well as just standalone pictures.
Okay, thanks. The next 2 are comments more than questions. And let me know if you'd like to respond to them. You can find a toggle switch in the dark and identify its position up or down. Sometimes classic design is hard to beat. Comments, thoughts?
No, amen. I mean, he's not wrong, and I guess, or he or she. I'm sorry, I don't know who sent that in. That makes a good point. I mean, I think what I would say is that is there something there that could be is there something? Okay, so you know how like increasingly they're getting rid of like even like the button on the iPhone or whatever, and then people are like, dang it, I like to have a button, and then they were like, oh, we got to put a fake bump back in there so it feels like you're actually pushing a button. I might offer that everything about that comment is true, and there might still be a way that even with digital touch screens that they are able to simulate that. So I would say always be trying to think about the great stuff that made classic stuff classic and great, but there's might be a new form factor or a new way that we can apply it going forward.
Thank you. Next comment, not a question, just a comment, and sorry I came late, so I have missed everything up to the latest mention of user manuals. We have newly installed lighting controls in new schools. The project hasn't been completed 100% yet, but there are no users manuals yet.
Maybe that means they're great. Maybe that means you don't need one.
Well, that could go one of 2 ways. One of the things I always try to recommend to people is that they also make sure that they commission the occupants every time they have a lighting control system, so that they make sure that the occupants understand what's supposed to happen. Although that also could be referring back to my Don Norman quote, so or paraphrase really. Okay, how are the manufacturer samples chosen, and how are the manufacturer sample chosen and the individual wall stations chosen?
Yeah, we looked across abroad, like we did our sort of initial I don't know, dragnet of wall stations that were out there, and maybe came up with 24 different wall stations that represented this really wide range. And then we talked through the process, which was kind of developing our hypothesis, right, which focused especially around multi-scene spaces and the user experience, trying to make it clear. So ultimately, we winnowed it down to those 3 categories. And the reason we wanted to have single scenes in there is because single scenes are a implementation approach that we see implemented in the market. Maybe the best way to answer that is to say, we wanted to pick a range of wall stations that we felt represented the range of approaches being implemented in the market, and we had to winnow it down to a practical number. And 9 is like, a good number. 3 groups of 3 was a good number. So that's how it worked. It wasn't too much more scientific than that.
Okay, thank you. Thinking residential, you commonly enter dark rooms, so generic versus specific labeling is a moot point, as you can see neither. Of course, really, these systems are predominantly commercial, so this would be a good study to carry further with a broader participation. Thanks. And I'm going to say that this is probably the last question. However, there will be a question period after the side B, after we queue up Martha, my dear. And if you have other questions about this portion of the segment, please go ahead and type them in, and we'll get them answered at that time. So the final one for this section: were manufacturers contacted regarding this study? Were they interested in feedback toward their eventual redesign or adoption of results?
Yes, we reached out to all the manufacturers in our orbit I think especially, and that's Sean's really going to get into that because that's where the majority of we went more in depth with manufacturers on the configuration tool side, which you're going to see here shortly. And yes, we made a cool little memo. It was like, here's what we're doing, here's where we think the value is. We're going to give you all the feedback, and yeah, by and large, people were like, cool, let us know what you find out. I'm paraphrasing, but for brevity's sake, I think that's the best answer I can give.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. So let's queue up then side B here, which is all about the app-based configuration tools for this level of system hardware.
Yeah, Sean, why don't you click us? Why don't you click us in? I'm folks. Sean was kind enough to just let me take the prologue on this. So, you know, when we talk about these app-based configuration tools, we're talking about how most modern NLC systems are set up and programmed and then commissioned and operated, right? And they're increasingly app-based. And this is what I wanted to highlight for folks. Next slide, please. There are so many different approaches out there, especially like when Sean and I were looking at this, I kept imagining this like beautiful tree of life. And this little analogy that I'm about to make for app-based wall stations or app-based configuration tools, we could have had this at the front of the whole presentation talking about wall stations too, but it really helped me think about this in terms of like, we have all these different approaches that are happening out there. It's kind of like this evolutionary, the technology evolutionary tree of life branching out. And app-based configuration tools happen to be this sort of major proliferation that is happening right now, right? And that's not unique to lighting, that's unique to all sorts of manufacturers of products who are seeking to leverage the broader trend of, I got an app for that, or there's an app for that, right? So even though we're focused in this area, we really wanted to be careful that we weren't, you know, we weren't intentionally putting blinders on to not look at other areas. Companies that offer cloud-based services only, they're like, you don't even need the app. Like the app is the problem, right? They might tell you. And so there's lots of different approaches. We're not saying app-based is the winner by any means, but we are focusing on this, you know, major trend that's happening. And Sean, maybe this would be a great place for you to take it, because even within app-based systems, we're not talking about every single system under the sun. So I'll shut myself up.
All right, thank you. Hello, folks. Apologies, I am not going to be nearly as festive or animated as Mr. Wilson has been. And thank you for truly interesting first half of the seminar here. It really is interesting as somebody who kind of has, some of you know me and know that I have some fairly firm opinions on things. It's really interesting to see where those opinions are confirmed or corrected based on fairly objective research, which is really good. So as John mentioned, you know, this kind of approach that we're talking about here is really specific to this middle range of equipment within the industry, right? The sort of parts and pieces, sort of parts approach in a lot of ways. And the second half of this is really heavily informed based on really the outcomes of what we learned from 3+ years of doing the hands-on 1- and 2-day network lighting controls classes that we've put together that really were very specifically designed around product that was easily understood, because we're trying to teach concepts, right? Was advanced enough to be able to handle basically all of the control strategies, or most of them, that we would expect to see today. And is something that can be used in both new construction and in retrofit applications, since we have 1.5 billion square feet of uncontrolled space out there already in the US. So let's see how we can go ahead and get that together. So the original approach here was that we were going to go ahead and put together in-person interviews with programmers, installers, implementers, using randomly selected pairs of lighting control system apps to have them go ahead and essentially put together a system in such a way that they would come to a predetermined outcome and then be able to give us some feedback about what was most complicated, what was least complicated, what was best, what was perhaps a little bit confusing, and so forth. Of course, as Robbie Burns tells us, the best laid schemes of mice and men, COVID had something to say about that. So we pivoted, much as we did in the first portion of this, and we decided that one of the ways that we could proceed forward in a way to really help the market, hopefully, would be to start to rethink this strategy and develop a baseline comparison of some of the systems that we've worked with on this class, and some others to be sure. And we've done that through conducting interviews with the various manufacturers, looking at market trends, looking at essentially a matrix that we'd put together, and then also making sure that we took a look at our the information that we had gotten from essentially 3 years of lighting controls classes that have heavily informed what we have kind of thought about from the perspective of not me, not John, not the lighting lab, but from the perspective of the people who have taken our classes throughout Oregon, Idaho, Washington, Montana, and at Light Fair, so that we could hopefully gain a better sense or a more informed sense of what really people can be using for these systems from a way to make them more easily implemented, more easily taken up in the industry, but also removing as many barriers to that uptake as we possibly can, right? So there are a lot of common themes that have emerged dealing with these classes, right? This is a list of the manufacturers that we've used in our 1 and 2 day classes. For those who haven't taken them or don't know much about them, in the 1 day class, I spent half the class working, well, in both of them, we spent half the class doing hands-on programming. In the 1 day class, we actually used 2 different manufacturers' control systems. So every participant gets to program at least some portion of a sequence of operations into the lighting controls through the app. In the 2 day class, we actually use 4 different manufacturers. So every participant will touch at least 4 different manufacturers' gear. And one of the best things about that is that then they get to see the commonalities and the divergent points of what is actually happening from a programming standpoint, but how it's all circling back together and coming effectively to the same end. Because, I mean, what we're doing is not terribly dissimilar system to system, right? So from a networked lighting control system standpoint, this mid-level kind of system, we started with this notion of the click and pair paradigm, right? We started with this notion of having individual devices. We could consider them individual room controllers, for example, that might have some network capability, meaning, you know, in this case, we've got let's say a wall device of some kind that might communicate wired or wirelessly to a variety of different types of sensors, but it's not terribly intelligent. It doesn't have a lot of advanced capabilities, and it really doesn't have much capability beyond that room, right? So that can be potentially simple, but also can be kind of confusing, and it's very limiting, right? Once we start to get into systems of any kind of scale, there's some inherent limitations there. So if I'm using this kind of a system and I'm trying to implement any kind of significant control strategy grouping like we might have here, like, how do we start to really approach these systems, right? How do we start to approach the multiple control strategies that we might have? And with the click and pair approach, we really have let's just say, some time and capability constraints in applying those things. Because if we come to a building that has any size at all, you'll quickly find as a designer, most of these control strategies are in use in a project of any scale in one portion of it or another, right? So we really need to start looking at how we get those capabilities, and we get those capabilities implemented quickly and easily. And then we go ahead, and if we add in any level of complexity at all with respect to sequence of operations, which hopefully we're going to do, because let's just be honest, that's how we're giving the best flexibility in the spaces and how we're also saving as much energy as we possibly can. So if you're still stuck with just that kind of parts and pieces click pair approach, you're going to find yourself very quickly standing on a desk trying to implement a daylight harvesting strategy, much as this poor fellow is. And I'll tell you, I forget. We've been using this photograph for so very long, I don't even remember where it came from. But it's such a compelling photograph, right? This is an example of trying to have to deal with parts and pieces that require you to be up next to those parts and pieces rather than with some kind of app-based programming tool. All right, so the industry has moved to this whole notion of programming via app, and we're told that it is a huge step forward because it's faster, it's simpler, it's easier, and there are a lot of potential benefits there, right? Easy access, it's open. You don't necessarily have to have a specific software tool that you're getting from manufacturer X. You're usually getting it from the Google Play Store or from the Apple Store, right? They offer typically extended programming capabilities. Maybe they save time. We'll talk about how some of these things come together. They might have help features. They might guide the user. But a key thing here is, how do we make these apps really understandable so that end users and implementers have a very, very easy time setting the systems up, and so that then later facilities people, when they make the inevitable changes, can go ahead and deal with those quickly and easily. So we started, much as John mentioned in the first part, when we came up with our various hypotheses with respect to the lighting control stations. We also started with some hypotheses based on the programming apps. And again, these are heavily informed by the discussions that we had with our students, and those discussions were shared with the manufacturer representatives who were at the classes themselves. So a lot of this stuff shouldn't particularly be new to at least some of you that I see that are on the call here. So we came up with distilling this down to basically 4 elements, right? So apps work best for users when you can pair or discover multiple devices in a single process, right? So that's a hopefully simplicity and time-saving issue. When repetitive actions have streamlining shortcuts, again, a time issue. The primary control methods are easy and obvious to access and modify. So that's also a time issue, but it's a simplicity issue, right? It's how do we get past the notion of, as Don Norman said, a user's manual represents a failure of design, right? How do we make these things really obvious? And the last one of those is that these systems really should have integral help features. Now, exactly what that means, there are a lot of different ways we can talk about that. We'll see some examples. So if we start with this framework that we've got these 4 basic ideas, what do? Well, as John mentioned earlier, we step back and let's look at the market. As we did with the wall stations, we've gone ahead and sort of taken the pulse of the market out there and seen what was available, right? Because this is a little bit more challenging, we didn't go ahead and put together a web-based tool. We actually did some in-person discussions. Before we did the in-person discussions, we really were looking at what are the commonalities, what are the divergent points here from these apps? How can we learn from that, right? are there really good divergent points? Are there reasons for those divergent points? Are there good commonalities? How can we reinforce these things? So we looked at this in some depth, as you can, I hope, imagine, and we decided that there were roughly 14 different stages of programming potential, from sort of the time when you download an app to the time when you maybe have to start to reconfigure and reprogram a system. And within there were at least 104 different decision nodes. Now, I want to be clear, not every project is going to have you making 104 decisions, but there are various steps along the way that you may or may not have to make for project X or for room Y within project X, right? So what are these kinds of potential stages? Well, we started again with the notion of downloading a programming app from the Google Store or from Apple, from whomever that happens to be. In some cases, it was actually from the manufacturers themselves, although we have a strong preference, I think, for keeping it easy to download and implement. So we would start with the programming apps and the networking that was required. So that networking might be communication between the app and a mesh network of devices. It might be communication between the programming app and a hub that had some kind of star network, whatever that communication method was. And then going through the various steps of discovering all the devices, programming scenes, programming sensor and wall station hardware, is ultimately going through to the notion of what happens after the initial programming, or even after the initial occupancy. What happens a year later when we go ahead and decide that we want to fully reprogram a space? Let's say the space use has changed, or we have a floor with demountable partitions and we've gone ahead and changed the entire setup of the space. These are all kind of things that we looked at and discussed with the various manufacturers. So how do we prioritize some of this stuff? Well, the idea was that the key concepts were really all about the commonalities, the divergences. How can we save time? How can we cause the least confusion? And almost most importantly, what are the additional barriers and how can we remove them? Or what are just the kind of things that, as lighting people, we find to be obvious, but maybe not so obvious to people who aren't lighting people? At the end of the day, as we kind of alluded to earlier, simplify, 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 right? Thoreau was right. So who did we talk to? We completed either full interviews or discussions with 9 different manufacturers, all of whom were fantastic and really, really wonderful to give us a good deal of their time and their thoughts with respect to their respective systems. Now, we could have gone ahead and answered all of the interview questions that we were posing to them ourselves with a set of with the setup apps. So we weren't asking, or we weren't trying to ask anyway, any intellectual property questions, anything that might be challenging from the standpoint of competitiveness or any of those things. We really were just trying to get ourselves a decent baseline of how do these systems work, how do people interact with them, and again, where are those commonalities and divergence points? So the great news is that no matter whose system we're talking about, and I highlight this in my classes, that today network lighting controls, even over just 5 years ago, are so tremendously better than they have ever been before, right? Most of them are distributed in some manner or other. Most of them feature wireless capabilities. They're more capable. This is my favorite little thing here. They're both more complex, but really less complicated than they've ever been before. So this is kind of the place we find ourselves in, where we have the opportunity to really push these systems in a way that we've never. Strategies. There's nothing new about the ideas, but now we have better capabilities than ever before. So each of these systems has have a lot of commonalities. They have a lot of features that they share, in particular the hardware, right? There's a similar kit of parts. There's only so many ways that you can make a 0 to 10 volt load controller, right? That's going to populate into the nipple of a junction box, right? There's only so many ways that you can come up with wired or wireless devices. Now, the communication method is going to be different. Some might communicate via Zigbee, some might communicate via some proprietary protocol, Bluetooth, whatever it happens to be, but there's a wide range of wall stations. We've already seen that, a wide range of labeling options. The best part from my perspective is that they're much easier to specify than they've ever been before, right? We don't have such hugely different hardware pieces that it makes specification difficult. We'll talk a little bit about NLC. That's kind of a special case coming through there. But setup and programming, there are a lot of commonalities as well, right? Most systems allow you to configure most elements of your occupancy and vacancy sensors from the apps. Most have some advanced sensor options. Most will allow you to do high-end trim. And one of the coolest things is that most of the time, wall stations are pre-configured. Anybody that's been around in digital controls for a while will know that when we used to program wall stations, we used to actually have to spend some time telling the system what kind of wall station it was. I used to have a Honeywell system where I used to have to do that stuff. Now, when the device is discovered, it really in all cases that we've done, the device is recognized according to what type and pre-configuration it has, which is truly delightful. So what about some of the other things and maybe some of the divergent points and some of the recommendations we can come up with? Well, first, a quick note about vocabulary, right? As George Bernard Shaw once sagely noted, England and America are two countries separated by the same language. So we have a whole bunch of systems here. We talked about 9 different systems, and there are, of course, others out there. And we have an industry that is somewhat fragmented, right? As I tell students, one of the few standards in the lighting controls industry is that there are becoming a bigger problem. So we find this all the time in our classes, that there is confusion with respect to vocabulary, right? And it would really, really, really help, I think, if we would go ahead and adopt the same words for the same topics. So I'm going to tell you, I've been doing lighting controls for more than 30 years, starting in theater. So you guys tell me, is something a zone, a group, a channel, a room, an area? Doing these interviews, even with a strong background in lighting controls, there was some significant challenges with respect to understanding and communication, because words are not really being used the same way through everybody's systems, right? So I'm going to make a really, 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 really hard push here. Can we please adopt at least a common vocabulary, whether that's IES DG16 based, whether that's Lighting Controls Association based, whatever it happens to be. But if I tell somebody about a lighting control zone, I want them to know that it's 2 light fixtures or 1 or more light fixtures that never, ever, ever want to do anything but dim up or dim down together. Or I want to use the word channel, or I want to use the word group. I don't care which, but I want it to be the same, right? So I hope that makes sense to everybody. All right, so the next part, one of our key hypothesis questions was with respect to device discovery. So every single one of these systems will be comprised of essentially a kit of parts, right? We'll have load controllers and or maybe digital driver controllers. We're going to have sensors and wall stations of various types and ancillary devices, all of these things. And they all need to be discovered either by each other or by a central gateway or hub for programming, right? And we can do a lot of different things with them. We can associate them with rooms. We can associate sensors to load controllers or zones. We can associate load controllers to zones or groups and so forth. We kind of know all those things, right? So we had this initial hypothesis that the key differentiator was going to be that devices or systems that automatically discovered devices were going to be superior to those that didn't. The reality is it's a little bit more nuanced. So basically all the systems we looked at either do this automatic device discovery where you press a button and the system starts querying for all of the devices within radio range, or you wind up having a system where you have QR codes or barcodes on the devices themselves. Usually that means that there's a QR code on the device. There's a sticker that you can take off and you can put it onto an as-built drawing, so that you know that light fixture L21 in room 3 is going to be on zone 6, right? So you get that cue. Some systems actually have a hybrid approach where they will discover all the devices, but the goal is to have done that kind of stickering approach onto a set of plans so that you then don't have to spend a lot of time blinking each control zone to figure out which one it is. Okay, I've got a device in my programming app, load controller X, is that zone 1 or is that zone 57? Okay, let me blink it and so I can see. So the nuance comes in as it turns out that the theory was that automatic device discovery would be much faster. And I suspect the reality is that it really comes down to user preference, whether you want to spend the time up front during pre-planning or you want to spend the time on site after doing the blink device discovery. It's probably a wash between the two. So think about it that way. So that's one kind of key divergence point that we thought would be more challenging than it really is. Another divergence point is the idea of guided setup, right? So most of these apps feature one of two approaches. Either you have an intuitively guided app, meaning it takes you from step A to step B to step C, and it may in fact even show you some kind of visual prompt like you see on the screen here with some kind of icon or imagery. Or the power user app approach. So the power user app is the notion that somebody has had training or knows specific information about them. Sort of our thought is that the intuitively guided app is much better for a new user, right? Because it makes you walk through the systems, but it potentially takes additional time, right? So there are, again, arguments to be made for both approaches, the power user versus the intuitive app. One suggestion would be that it would be really terrific if we could meld the two and actually go ahead and have some kind of toggle within a system so that I'm a power user, I'm not a power user, please help me, right? So that's one approach. Sensor configuration. So most of the systems that are out there, which is fantastic, will allow for configuration of most, if not all, sensor functions through the app itself. So is the device an occupancy sensor or a vacancy sensor? Is there some kind of dynamic time scheduling so that perhaps during daylight hours, it's a vacancy sensor, after hours, it's an occupancy sensor? What about daylighting controls, right? What about daylight harvesting? Are there very specific requirements there? Do we have to calibrate during the daytime? Do we have to calibrate during the nighttime? And of course, daylight calibration is going to be a lot more challenging. At the end of the day, the big thing that we'd like to make sure that everybody is doing with their apps is that full functionality should be available from the app, not necessarily from the sensor device. We really want to get away from the notion of getting on ladders. Once the major installation is done, we shouldn't have to get on a ladder again. Streamlining. So one of the most annoying things and things that keeps coming up time and again from our classes is the notion of repetition. So when we are programming some of these bigger enterprise systems, we know that we can copy and paste, and it's really in a lot of ways an exercise in putting together relational databases. We don't have quite that same ability in these mid-level systems. But there are potential ways that we can develop things like archetypes or room templates, scene templates, wall station templates, whatever they happen to be. And then maybe also put in things like keyword set capabilities so that rather than having to retype the word conference or corridor or AV 60 times on a project, we go ahead and have the ability to tag those, right? So these are some things to think about. The easiest ones that we find have these kinds of streamlining capabilities. Another big one is data logging, right? Data logging or dashboarding of some kind. Most of the systems have at least some level of reporting ability. Most of the time that means metering or energy trending, although not all. And we think that all should have that basic capability to be able to set these things up and to produce this kind of information. Two very specific things that keep coming up. We keep hearing, particularly from commissioning agents and our utility partners, that it would be really, really, really helpful to be able to export initial setup data from these systems, so that if we had a common way to, say, export an Excel file or a tab delimited file or some kind of report where we would go ahead and be able to tell what the initial programming was. What are the sensor timeouts? What are the high-end trim target light levels? Has the daylight harvesting been programmed? Has the high-end trim been programmed? All of these things would be very, very helpful. The other part of that is, interestingly enough, that we hear constantly in our classes is battery life. Having a way to track and report out on battery life for things like wireless wall stations, wireless sensors, any kind of wireless elements. That sort of fear of having batteries go bad without anybody knowing it is frankly a key barrier to the adoption of some of this wireless technology. So it would be great if all systems, probably 2/3, I'm going to say in our functionality test, had the notion of how you would go ahead and do battery life monitoring. Another one, so to kind of come back to, John was talking about Captain Obvious. George Bernard Shaw said, "No question is so difficult to answer as that which the answer is obvious." It seems obvious to me that any help or any app system should have some level of in-help documentation. It turns out that most don't, which is very strange to me. But the reality is you can be the best skier in the world, and at some point you're still going to be down roped from a chairlift if something goes wrong, right? So having some kind of ability to hopefully have some kind of context-driven helps options. I'm in the middle of doing this task. I don't know what to do. Please help me with this task. If that's not available, then a help menu. If that's not available, then some kind of way to easily go to external system documentation, either media, videos, maybe PDF files, whatever it is, but we don't want to have our system installers having to go to a PDF file that they have to download from the internet somewhere. Also, easy access to things like helplines and chats, right? Remote system access options, possibly. So it might be that a tech at manufacturer X has the ability to actually log into your app and see what's going on. That would be an excellent thing as well. Reprogramming, right? We keep talking about how simple reprogramming is, and reconfiguration simplicity is one of the big selling points that we talk about these things. But ultimately, we want to make sure that these systems are really, really easy to reset factory reset devices from the apps themselves, right? We don't want to have to get on a ladder except to move the devices if we need to. In many cases, we don't necessarily need to move the devices. We just need to reprogram them. So any kind of reconfiguration stuff should be available in the app alone. Okay. Luminaire level lighting controls. We've talked about that earlier. Now, one of the key things here is to think about this notion that we are taking all of the sensors and the load controllers, all the logic, and bringing it into one device, right? Now, that one device is likely to be part of a network lighting control system rather than a standalone. We've had this idea of these luminaire level lighting controls. We used to call them vertically integrated lighting systems. This has been around for 30-something years. But we are now at a point where we can have these integrated into a larger lighting control system so that we can have one lighting control system for a project rather than multiple ones. So how does that then integrate into the app? Well, it turns out that roughly half of the manufacturers that we worked with, or we talked with, have luminaire level lighting control systems available now. 2 more of them said that that ability was in process. Now, this is becoming a big thing, and it's becoming a big thing for a lot of good reasons. One of the key ones is that not all lighting control systems have a lighting designer or a lighting engineer involved with them. So having the ability to simply order something from a factory that's going to have programmability without a great deal of design time is hugely valuable, I think, in the marketplace, right? As John mentioned, typically what we wind up seeing with respect to these configurations is that the LLC, everything is in one place. So it's its own unique address. It's got its own sensors. It can function kind of maybe 70% of the way there, even if nobody does anything to it. The preference, of course, is that we go ahead and fine tune it and do all those things, versus in a more typical network lighting control system where we may still have individual unique addresses, but we're typically talking to fewer sensors. We're typically needing a lot more thought with respect to the initial design and the initial installation. So one of the things we keep hearing is that luminaire level lighting controls either take more time to set up or take less time to set up. It's interesting, there's sort of 2 camps, and one side says it takes a lot longer, oh no, we can't do it. One side says it takes a lot less time and that we have to do it. The reality is that the parts and pieces are slightly different, right? Since you have an integral load controller, daylight sensor, occupancy vacancy sensor, you've got fewer devices to discover, and but ultimately the programming time is actually pretty similar. If you're going to fine tune it, if you're just going to put them up in the ceiling and go with the base level programming, obviously it's quicker, right? But if you're going to fine tune the systems, there's not that much variance with respect to how these things come together. So when possible, please go ahead and implement them. And those manufacturers that don't have the ability to do luminaire level controls, this is I won't even say it's coming, it's here. So I would suggest that everybody get on board for this. All right. So those are kind of the big ticket items that that we were looking at, right? I mean, the questionnaire was 104, 105 questions long, but those really start to get to the key salient points of what we're really looking for with respect to those commonalities, those divergent points, and some of those barriers that we might be able to either eliminate or at least alleviate in as many ways as we possibly could. And really want to kind of highlight this for people. The lighting industry is perhaps one of the most siloed elements of the building industry that there is. So many different players really don't necessarily communicate with each other. So how do we start to think about some of the motivations of these elements of the supply chain, right? We've got manufacturers, contractors, engineers, users, sales reps. The theory is that we all have different motivations, but at the end of the day, again, there are still commonalities, right? We're all trying to save time, everybody's time. We're all trying to increase the uptake. We may not know it, but the more of these systems, the that we can get out there, the more flexible and better our spaces are, right? That's better for architects, owners, and users. It's also better for manufacturers and sales reps. We're trying to reduce frustration. We're trying to increase user satisfaction. All these things are important. So we're all on the same side, pushing in the same direction. And it's important to recognize that, right? So to the extent that we can make these things simple for everyone, it's better for everyone, right? Because I got to tell you, as somebody who's been working in the lighting industry for a very long time, I've been able to get advanced or network lighting controls on almost every project I've ever done. But it's been a rocky road, right? It's been a hard push. And most lighting controls, or most projects, don't have that level of lighting control, or don't have somebody really committed to pushing for them. So in order to really get ourselves to this really straight road heading into the Front Range here, it makes it imperative that we take this opportunity that we have to simplify everything and make things easy for everyone, right? And there are a lot of elements to this, right? Some of those things are not new, right? We want to have energy monitoring. We want to have controls persistence so that things don't change. Some of the newer ones that are out there for us, well, cybersecurity. 5-10 years ago, we weren't really talking about cybersecurity, at least not as much, with respect to lighting control systems or color tuning, right? Color tuning, the Internet of Things, all of these things are coming. So how do we most effectively as an industry start to address those things? Well, it's by making things easier for everyone. So I've just got a, sort of top 10. I don't have the really cool sort of graphics that John had here, but I've taken basically 10 ideas, and we'll flesh these out in the report later. But the key recommendations here, sort of in order: adopt a common vocabulary and standards. Right? There's no reason in 2020 we can't have more standardization in both the way we talk about lighting controls and the way we implement those controls. Keep the acquisition of the apps simple. Make the apps free. Don't have to have extensive vetting process with a manufacturer in order to use the app. Try to at least adopt a guided user experience progression where you can, right? And provide in-app help. I have used these apps. I could personally use in-app help. If I can use in-app help in some cases, I guarantee that most other people can as well. Remove ladders, right? We don't want to have ladders for most of our systems once they are already installed. Provide additional functionality, particularly energy and setup dashboarding, right? Provide those opportunities right from the devices, right from the simple app. John alluded to this earlier too, about taking a look at the market. We all tend to get that real tunnel vision, but make it a point to experience other apps, right? See what other people are doing and see if we can't come together and develop this common vision, right? As part of that, every single manufacturer should be operating on this whole idea of open API, because we need to be able to be integrating into other systems. Now, it seems funny that I'm saying that at the same time that I'm also saying simplify, 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 as we've got an image of Thoreau's Walden here, right? But those things are not necessarily divergent, right? Keep the interfaces simple while going ahead and allowing interoperability within the smart building ecosystem, because ultimately this is where we're going. Even with these systems, we're not going to try to convince anybody of this, because I think everybody's already convinced of this, right? Everybody understands that lighting and lighting controls are going to be a big part of the future here. And I'm going to kind of leave with this. And the idea is that, I've talked to a lot of people, and some folks tend to be really concerned about their intellectual property, right? And I get it, right? I don't want to necessarily share my intellectual property either in a lot of cases, but the reality is I mean, unless we want to be left in the dust trying to figure out how to reprogram an old VCR, we're going to have to adopt this notion. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, did anybody here know what this symbol on the left meant? Today it's ubiquitous. 20 years ago, did anybody know what USB was, right? Maybe a handful of us. But this kind of simplification and convergence is really, I think, what's necessary. So with that, I am going to hand this portion back to John, and then we'll begin the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That's great. And man, you know what I think I'd like to do? Up. Is it possible, Sean? Is it possible for me to take back control here? Let's see. Show the screen. Is it possible to take back as presenter?
You are now the presenter.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Boy, all right. Thank you, everybody. Man, that was awesome. So I want to talk, you know, Sean just teed all that up. You guys have been great listening to all this. What's over the horizon, right? One of the questions we just had was like what's next for us? Do we plan on connecting with other research that's out there? Our priority focus really, you know, is going to be making sure this information gets back out to industry. So hopefully we're connecting, right? Not just there's that expression, ships passing in the night, and it's like I feel like in our industry it's ships passing in the day, you know, and just like, man, not connecting. And so we are going to make an effort, especially with our good friends at NIA, to try and get this information out with industry partners and figure out what happens next. Yeah, you know, we're also going to share it here locally. What we do is the Lighting Design Lab, incorporate these findings into our curriculum and then get those out to the design community, product specifiers around the region. If there is an opportunity and demand, there definitely is the potential to extend the research, no doubt. And we would love to come back and, you know, this definitely seems like the sort of thing that could, you know, merit some sustained effort. So, you know, I kind of alluded to, you know, LDLs, I call it the carrier group, NLC education, right? We got everything. It's like if 1 and 2 day workshops that Sean referenced is the, you know, carrier here, flagship. We have these other 2-hour courses that are sort of complementary, tunable light and health. You know, got these, who knows what those are? Look like light carriers, power over Ethernet, NLC for school districts, NLC for warehouses, exterior lighting, the healthcare class, rounding out the applications, and then one third of America's nuclear triad right there, communicating the value of NLC. So, you know, we're going to take the highlights, the sweet spots, and kind of make sure it gets added to our offerings here. Want to remind folks, we've got this suite of NLC resources available to the public, with 3 that will be available starting in January. These new schools, hospitals, and warehouses available on LDL's website. We'll post this video. If you want to reach out to us, a recording from today's webinar, we'll post this, so it'll be available. You can also download the slides if you haven't already. Welcome to reach out to me or Lighting Design Lab here. We'd love to hear from you. And I showed this up front, but man, I didn't really highlight enough. I said I wasn't going to get specific, but I really want to call out the UW IDL team, Chris, Meek, and Heather. Thank you guys so much for your guidance and you know, insights throughout this project. The WSU ID plus CL team, Shelby and Julia, you guys were awesome. And you know, the LDL and NIA peeps who helped make this happen as well. It was a really awesome team. And man, I feel like when Sean was talking there, I almost forgot it was 2020. So hopefully y'all felt that way for at least part of this webinar. We really appreciate y'all hanging in there with us. So with that said, Sean and I can both go a little bit long if there's some additional questions that would like to come in. But we understand we're nearing the top of the hour and folks got to peace out. We do ask that you please take the little quick online survey when you exit the webinar. You know, we always dig that stuff. And we'll see you next year. Folks who want to stay on the line, have just a few questions coming in here, we'd be happy to, Sean and I are going to stay on and answer those. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Sean, got you there. So next question that came in, question and a comment, it looks like, thank you for the informative sessions. The lack of standardization really exacerbates the other issues. No doubt. That's my commentary, no doubt. For example, we can handle more complexity if it is standardized, if it's standardized complexity. Going back to your takeaways, simplification of app acquisition for cybersecurity. Please share your ideas on how we as an industry can adopt a secure wireless startup and handoff to the contractor and business owner.
Okay, so first, Gabe, thank you for that. I fully agree with the standardized complexity. Joe, the real question here, cybersecurity is a tough one, right? Because there are issues for wired systems, there are issues for wireless systems, and the general sense, at least that I get from a cybersecurity world, is that it's a question of when your system gets hacked and not if your system gets hacked. So there is a UL, and please forgive me, it's escaping my memory at the moment what the number is, but there is a UL standard for cybersecurity for connected lighting, not just lighting, but for connected building systems, wireless building systems. So if you Google that, you can find that. The biggest sort of best practice I can sort of give you is keep the system separate, which is to say, I know a lot of people like to try to piggyback smart building systems onto corporate lands. I think that's a really bad idea. It adds a little bit of cost to go ahead and have your HVAC and lighting and whatever operating on its own unique building operation system network, but that makes a whole lot more sense to me than having to go ahead and cancel a whole bunch of credit cards when there's a problem. So that would be the number one thing I would tell you. But beyond that, I would suggest going ahead and taking a look at the UL standard.
Great. And you know, I just want to highlight, these are really just two comments that came in. One was asking if this will be available, the recording of this will be available, and absolutely a recording will be available. We'll upload it to our website, the resource pages of our website, and we'll also probably share that in one of our upcoming newsletters, I imagine. So that will be made available. Someone says it looks like the website hasn't been updated in a little bit, and that might just be a little, I don't know, it might be a case of the holidays. But we will make sure that these all get posted. So makes me feel good to know people are checking. So thanks for that feedback, though. So I think that's it for questions coming in. Sean, any final words here?
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you all very much. Cheers, everybody. Take care. Happy New Year.
Happy holidays and a better 2021.
Yeah, cheers to that.